How did you get into the whole business, especially of being such an expert regionally, but especially Maryland economy?
Oh, that happened in the early 1990s. I had a mentor, Dr. Michael A. Conti. We were university researchers. He was my boss. At our annual conference, he would talk about the national economy, and my job as his underling was to talk about the Maryland economy. So I talked about the economy of St. Mary's City or Sykesville or Baltimore City or whatever it happened to be. So I learned a fair amount about our municipalities and our counties, so on and so forth over time, and have followed the data ever since.
So when you were following it back in the early 90s, what was the economy of Frederick like?
Oh, much smaller, much less a focal point. Back then, so much of the economic activity was still in a Montgomery County or Prince George's County, and the growth was large in those counties as well. And that was a period of smart growth. You may remember the governorship of Paris Glendenning. It was all about smart growth, about developing densely developed areas, mass transit-oriented development, so on and so forth. Some of those principles still exist, but back then that was where the growth was taking place, already urban areas. Obviously, over the past 30 years or so, we've seen a real reversion, and we've become more suburban as a state. We've probably seen some more sprawl, so on and so forth. But back then, Frederick was an outpost, really. No one really thought too much about it.
There was not much industry out there. There was not much of an economy. It was a bedroom community.
That's exactly right. It was a bedroom community. It was not thought as a major business center. Downtown Frederick had yet to establish itself as a major destination for visitors, for shoppers, those kinds of things. Not as many restaurants, certainly not as many boutiques. And so it's really been over the last several years that Frederick has really emerged as this aspirational city, a city where people want to live but also want to visit quite frequently. And in fact, many communities around the state want to grow up to be Frederick, Maryland, as it turns out. They want that kind of live, work, play dynamic. They want that kind of tax-based growth. They want that kind of ingenuity, the roster of employers, so on and so forth. And so this is a fairly recent phenomenon. This boom of Frederick.
As a young man in the 1990s, could you have predicted this?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, we knew that there were some population pressures, that people were looking for more affordability. Montgomery County had become so expensive, and not just Bethesda, Chevy Chase, but Rockville and Gaithersburg and so on and so forth. And we also knew that Howard County was becoming more expensive, Columbia in particular. And so there might be some migration, but this is not just about location. It's not just about demographics. Frederick offers something that other communities do not offer. That's the thing. It's not enough to have a nice location, let's say at the terminus of I-270. I mean, Baltimore is at the terminus of I-70, yet Baltimore City has lots of issues. So it's not just about location, it's about something else. It's about quality of life. It's about appeal. It's about functioning government. All those kinds of things matter. It's about schools. And so Frederick has put together a really wonderful value proposition that's drawing more and more people to that community. Employers, residents, visitors. And of course, what that does is it engenders even more economic dynamism, and even more people get attracted to that dynamism. And that's where we are right now.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
A virtuous cycle, where success begets success. That's what we see in Frederick. And sometimes failure begets failure, as it turns out. A community in decline can stay in decline for quite some time. We know that, including here in Maryland. But that certainly is not the Frederick story. The Frederick story is one of success. And the outlook is quite bright because, of course, it's been a history of upward movement in incomes and dynamism, so on and so forth. And so that's exactly right. That virtuous cycle is very much in place.
Was it something specifically that they did, or was it even more a kind of a prevailing attitude, a willingness to change, willingness not to resist change so much?
Yeah, I think it's been a very diverse place. I mean, even before Europeans really settled these lands, even then it was a trading route. Many different tribes of Native Americans wandered through Frederick. Now, I mean, that's ancient history, obviously, and maybe not particularly relevant to the 21st century. Nonetheless, it's interesting because thereafter, as Europeans begin to settle the United States, guess what? Frederick remains diverse, attracting Protestants and Catholics and Jews and so on and so forth, people of color, and it has been diverse. And so that attitude of inclusion seems to be built into Frederick's DNA. That's what I'm getting at. And that's very important because at the end of the day, that's what people, or at least many people, want. is to be included, to feel engaged in a community. Well, Frederick has been that for many people. Not to say there haven't been issues, not to say there weren't issues in the 19th century, those kinds of things. I think we understand that there were. Nonetheless, overall, relative to many other communities, Frederick has been more welcoming. And so part of Frederick's success has been to continue along that line, to be appealing to many different types of people, doing many different types of things. And so that's where we are right now, economically, socially, so on and so forth. And from the perspective of prestige, Frederick is a prestigious community. That matters because people want to be associated with winning. You know, whether it's the Baltimore Orioles or the Baltimore Ravens or the city of Frederick, people want to be associated with winners, and the city of Frederick is one of them.
That's interesting because when I first moved there, and for many years afterwards, I was always teased for living in Fredneck. So they managed to change their perception. How do you do something like that as a community?
I think you repeatedly turn lemons into lemonade. So, of course, we had the vicious floods of the 1970s, the mid-70s. And Frederick is on its back as a community. No one's thinking about moving to Frederick at that time, right? I mean, we're just talking about functionality. And they turn those lemons into lemonade. Right, Carroll Creek Linear Park and investment in flood control so the water can flow safely through downtown Frederick. So they turn storm management or stormwater management into an economic development device. Who does that? Very few people do that. And so when you can take the opportunity to change as a real opportunity to say, well, we've got to do something about this flooding, what else can we do? How can we be innovative? How can we push this flood control or stormwater control under the ground and then above it build something that people really want to spend time in? This linear park and the balance of downtown Frederick. That's the magic. And what it translates into, by the way, what it gets at is high quality leadership. You need bold, visionary, high quality leadership. And Frederick has benefited from that. Some great mayors. That matters. Leadership matters. You know, my view is that if Baltimore City is really going to become the dynamic city that it could be, it's going to need some great mayors. It hasn't had that recently. That's my view. People can disagree. But Frederick has benefited from very strong leadership, and I hope that tradition continues going forward.
So what is the lesson then for other towns and cities around America who have seen their downtowns decimated? What could you learn from Frederick?
Look, I mean, some of this is not generalizable. What do I mean by that? Frederick happens to be at the terminus of I-270. It happens to border some very wealthy counties that are spitting off a lot of wealthy households into Frederick, Montgomery and Howard counties, for instance, also Carroll County to a certain extent. So, I mean, for an Allegheny County, Maryland, or a Kent County, Maryland, those kinds of dynamics don't necessarily exist. So, you know, downtown Cumberland or downtown Chestertown could not necessarily replicate a lot of what's happening in downtown Frederick. Again, location matters. However, Frederick also provides insight into what it is people want. What kind of experiences do they want? What mixture of services do they want? And what does a great afternoon or evening or weekend look like? And so whether it's Chestertown or Cumberland or Hagerstown, which is working on its arts district, and downtown Hagerstown has some features similar to downtown Frederick, as it turns out, in terms of architecture, scale, so on and so forth. What these communities are trying to do is trying to figure out what's the package look like. What did Frederick do to create this value proposition, and what aspects of that can we replicate? Because, you know, some of these communities also have certain advantages, right? Because Cumberland has a lower cost of living. You know, Chestertown is on a beautiful river, the Chester River, as an example. So there's some advantages these communities have that maybe Frederick can't, in some cases, replicate. In any case, that's what Frederick offers. Not a perfect roadmap for any community, because every communities are different, but it offers some real insights into what humans crave.
What is it about the historic architecture that draws people? I mean, I understand people like to see it. It's interesting, but emotionally it speaks to them, and I haven't gotten anybody who's been able to tell me why. And I have a clue that you might be the one who knows.
I'm not an architect, but I seem to understand what people want. I mean, there's a reason that people migrate to towns like St. Augustine, Florida, Asheville, North Carolina, Annapolis, Maryland. There's something about the scale of these cities, and you see that in Frederick County as well, that buildings that are formidable, they're brick, they're stone, they're formidable, but they're not huge. They're not massive necessarily. Streetscapes that are very walkable. You know, places with sidewalks. which we shouldn't take for granted because a lot of places don't have sidewalks. That's what people want, that human scale, the calling of history. And you can see the history in the architecture, and it's been preserved. I mean, some communities have done a very bad job preserving their history. Let me give you an example, Atlanta, Georgia. I know Atlanta, Georgia is a very successful community, but not because of its architecture. They've torn down almost anything that's old. And so at some level, it's less interesting. It's impressive at some level too. It's so much new, it's shiny for now, but it has not preserved its history since, let's say, 1865. Frederick has in those buildings. So many great buildings have been lost to decay and deterioration. Frederick has managed to take care of some of its buildings throughout Great Depression or wherever it happened to be. Those buildings survived those periods to survive to become relevant in the 21st century. And now they're glorious examples of modernity in some sense in terms of what's happening inside the buildings, including, for instance, biotech research in some cases, but then also reminding us of our past. And so people really love that. And it's one of the reasons Frederick works so well.
When I interviewed you for the Hagerstown documentary, you talked about how jobs used to follow businesses, but now businesses follow where people live with particular skill sets. What has happened in Frederick in terms of that with the biotech companies coming there?
Same thing. So, we, as a state of Maryland, just set a record for the lowest unemployment rate in a state in recorded U.S. history. Now, it's not a lengthy record, as it turns out, but at 1.6%, which is where Maryland's unemployment was a few weeks ago, that's the lowest unemployment rate a state has ever registered. And so what's the challenge for employers? Well, among them is finding talent. So increasingly, businesses are not dictating to employees where you're going to come, where you're going to live, so on and so forth. It's not about, you're going to be in Bethesda, sorry, whether you like it or not. It's, you might work from home 2 or 3 days a week, but we want you on our team. And if we have to move to Frederick and open up an office there to make this appealing to you, because Frederick's population is growing, of course, then we'll do that. And that's what we're seeing. You also have some institutional strength there, of course, Fort Detrick and the biological research there. And this seems to have attracted a cluster of biomedical researchers doing all kinds of things. Some of them work in the private sector, some in the public sector, but that cluster is increasingly forming around Frederick. I mean, a few years ago, you'd talk about Rockville or Gaithersburg, Bethesda, Chevy Chase, so on and so forth. That motion has spread into Frederick now. And that's where many people want to live. Top scientists and engineers now want to live there, which is remarkable. Because a few years ago, if you had thought, well, no, they want to live in Washington, D.C., they want to live in Bethesda, they want to live in, someplace other than Frederick. And of course, you mentioned in part of your question before, a nickname for Frederick that's not, particularly benign. And so all of a sudden now, no. If you want to recruit top talent, Frederick is a great place to go because top talent wants to be there. That's a transformation. And it took maybe 50 years to get there, but here we are. And because the search for talent will continue going forward, that's one of the reasons to think that Frederick is going to continue to be very, very successful, though also more expensive over time.
And one of the reasons that talent wants to go there, well-educated talent wants to go there, is because Frederick has removed a lot of the impediments to diversity or the negative reaction to diversity, both in terms of gender, in terms of nationality, ethnicity. Is that correct, or I don't want to put words in your mouth here.
I think Frederick is an inclusive community. And maybe there was a time when that was not the reputation of Frederick. But, when you look at, going to the typical hospital, or going to the typical biological laboratory, wet space, so on and so forth, and look at who's working there. It's a diverse cast of characters. And so you cannot be a major player in biotechnology or biological research unless you embrace diversity. You can't do it. And so clearly what's happened is that Frederick feels good to people. People have visited and said, I like this place. People are so warm. They're so nice. The retailers are so nice. And maybe retailers are nice for a reason, right? They're trying to make sales. But many of us have gone into stores where we don't feel welcome. You don't feel that in Frederick. And so what can I tell you? It works. And again, you can trace that back, the ability to accommodate people of various backgrounds, back hundreds of years. And whether the reputation of Frederick has changed over time or not, what it is today is quite clear. a place where everyone of any kind of background, religious, ethnic, racial, whatever it happens to be, can feel comfortable in Frederick. And so employers, knowing that this community embraces diversity, say, well, we need a diverse workforce, whether we're in healthcare, whatever it happens to be. Frederick is a great place to recruit talent because it's growing population, it's adding talent. The cognoscenti are increasingly moving to Frederick. We should be there. Should have an office there, and that's what you see when you look at the list of employers. You see many high-profile private employers now in Frederick, which you would not have seen, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago.
And I'm sure you're the only one who's going to use the word cognoscenti in this documentary too. So congratulations.
I may also say Illuminati at some point. All kinds of things can happen.
Intelligentsia.
I should have said that actually first.
Talk about data centers. Data centers kind of a controversial issue up in Frederick. What are the pros and cons of it? And even, is that the attraction of data centers to Frederick, is that a function of its location, its workforce? What is it?
Well, let me be clear. I actually did some research on this. And in fact, it was for quantum loophole, as it turns out. So I looked that up. But, so, I want people to understand where I'm coming from. But I think it's a winner. And let me tell you why I think it's a winner, data centers. I mean, how else is one going to develop that much commercial tax base without adding significantly to traffic or school population? I mean, really quite remarkable. And this has been a secret in Loudoun County, or at least one of them, in terms of growing that tax base. Lots of data centers. Now, you can take things too far, perhaps. That might be the case in certain instances. But in Frederick, this data center movement is just getting going. Data centers clearly want to be there. There's some geographic implications to being in Frederick and across the river from Loudoun, all these kinds of things, and these things matter. And so there's an opportunity here to build a major commercial tax base, not add a lot to traffic, not overcrowd the schools, and therefore take tax pressure off the residential base. Now, this really matters given the current context. Why? Maryland is in the midst of an effort to vastly increase education expenditures in support of the blueprint for Maryland's future, educational reform. It's wildly expensive, billions of dollars. I'm not saying I'm an advocate or not, that's not my role here. But the state of Maryland does not have the money to pay for this. That much is clear. And as it turns out, massive fiscal shortfall is expected for out years. In fact, close to $2 billion in fiscal year 2028, that kind of thing. The state of Maryland doesn't have the money, but wants to engage in this spending. Who's going to feel the pressure of that financially? It's the Maryland taxpayer, and it's counties and municipalities, like Frederick, which happens to be the second largest incorporated town in Maryland. So there's going to be lots of pressure to raise taxes. At the county level, the county is going to push those pressures down to the municipalities. Okay, so it's very important that communities try to grow tax base in advance of these dynamics. Data center construction, development operations create the opportunity to create at least some of that tax base, to countervail some of these fiscal pressures that are going to emerge in the next few years. And most communities are not going to have that kind of option. Data centers are not looking to move every place. Frederick is their focus right now. And so now you ask me, what are the drawbacks? There's some drawbacks. As you know, data centers use a lot of electricity. To the extent that people are concerned about that, that's one thing. But look, if the data center is not in Frederick, it's going to be someplace else. Second, farmland. So to what extent would these data centers cannibalize farmland? That's, one of the great things about Frederick County is its rural heritage and trying to retain it. And having a dynamic center city like Frederick City helps that. Because if the population wants to be there, if the employers want to be there, it takes less development pressure. It puts less development pressure on the hinterland. But these data centers have to be in certain places. And to the extent that there's a loss of farmland, that's not a positive thing. And that's been one of the tensions in Frederick, of course, over these types of decisions.
So if you were to wave a magic wand, is there a number of data centers that you could come up with? Or is it based more on tax revenue from it?
I think it's based most on common sense. Where can one put the data centers such that there is less loss of farmland, that, they're not the most beautiful structures in the world. So you also don't want to destroy view corridors, so on and so forth. These are considerations. And at some point, you say enough's enough. But I will say that, one thing that's possible is also that data centers probably are going to be redeveloped over time. So you think about artificial intelligence, new kinds of computer chips, so on and so forth. These are adaptive reuse facilities. And so that's one of the things to think about, to look for, is the opportunity to have a data center today and then turn it into something else tomorrow. But that's the question, really, in my mind. Farmland, rural heritage, rural legacy, and try to preserve that. And you don't want to have so many data centers that you start to really compromise that aspect of life in Frederick.
Do you think it has the possibility of becoming an economic engine of the same magnitude that Fort Detrick has been for Frederick?
I don't know. I don't necessarily think so. You know, the number of people working in data centers is actually quite small. And they have some sufficient skills and so on and so on. And maybe there is a bit of a cluster to be formed there. But what Fort Detrick is doing is absolutely revolutionary. It's different. It produces all kinds of intellectual property. Data centers are, to a certain extent, a pre-existing technology. And I understand they're changing because of artificial intelligence. I understand that. But it's not like data centers are novel to humanity. But some of the things being done at Fort Detrick are positively novel. And so that creates a different scale of potential economic impact.
I'm trying to think of how to phrase this question. Frederick, as you pointed out, has a great agricultural history, very working class in a lot of ways in their history. Now it's become a knowledge economy. How does a community deal with that and successfully? It's really, I mean, we've talked about change, but that's an enormous amount of change over 40 or 50 years to go from people who were working in an agricultural field, and now it's PhDs and master's degrees and biotechnology and artificial intelligence. It's two completely separate worlds. How does that meld successfully?
Yeah, all of a sudden you've got engineers from various companies competing for $1 million townhomes and that kind of thing, right, in Frederick. And so that is different. I will say that that's part of the loss in some sense. I mean, in other words, with gain sometimes comes loss. And so some of that blue-collar heritage probably has been lost as people have been priced out of that market. I mean, that's part of the cost of success, as it turns out. People can call it gentrification or use whatever word they want to use, but clearly some people who once upon a time could afford to live in Frederick can no longer afford to live there. And we have to consider that. Now, what do you do about that? I don't know, frankly. Because you don't want to simply say, well, let's not succeed as a community because we want everyone to be able to afford this place. I mean, at some level you say, well, then we have to keep out the employers and the retailers and the boutiques and so on and so forth, which means ultimately you don't become a success story. And this is one of the most challenging aspects of local economic development, is how do you include everyone in the success story when success creates much higher cost of living. But that's where we are right now. You have highly educated population now in Frederick. Talk about all kinds of things that I would not understand, right? Biology, so on and so forth. They know the periodic table by heart, that kind of thing, right? Very interesting people. That's part of the buzz around town, right? You've got all the members of the intelligentsia running around, so on and so forth. And that's part of the success story. Is there an opportunity here, though, to make sure there are places to live for people who are the teachers, the nurses, people who are the construction workers, people who are working in logistical centers, fulfillment centers, that kind of thing. People who work as carpenters, so on and so forth. They're not just PhD MDs. I don't know. One of the things that is challenging is to embrace the concept of affordable housing. What does that mean? It sends off all kinds of alarm bells for a lot of people. But we know that a place that's so expensive is challenging for many people to live in, and if they work there, that's frustrating for them, right? Because that means lengthy commutes into Frederick. So how do we deal with that? My view is embrace density, because when you've got a place like Frederick where the land values are so high now, the only way to offer affordability, inclusiveness of that type, is by embracing dense development. But a lot of people don't like density. They push back on that. They don't want to see that. And if you have a level of density that's inconsistent with the human scale of Frederick now, that will create a new set of problems. So what I'm saying to you is, I have no solution for this. You can't win this because, again, success breeds its own problems. And one of those problems is, how do you remain inclusive as a community when the communities become so expensive?
Where do you place Frederick in this? For a national audience who'd be watching this documentary, who probably has never heard of Frederick or has no idea, where would you place it in terms of its success its economic rebound, all that sort of stuff.
Here's what I would say. If you're going to live in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, Pennsylvania, Maryland, so on and so forth, you're not going to find many communities nicer than Frederick, Maryland. In other words, if you have your choice of where to live in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, Frederick is going to be at the very top of your list. Yes, there's Annapolis and Lancaster County and so on and so on. There are other prestigious communities in the mid-Atlantic region. We understand that. Everyone knows that. But Frederick, from a quality of life perspective, is hard to beat, including in the state of Maryland. So if you're coming to Maryland, take a look at Frederick. And if you choose not to live in Frederick because your job happens to be in Anne Arundel County or whatever it happens to be and you want that kind of commute, then at least know that you should visit Frederick frequently because it makes for a heck of an evening or a weekend.
One of the amenities that Frederick is missing is the downtown hotel. I mean, could you talk about that?
Yeah, I really think that that's true. So we've talked about the fact that you have all these scientists and engineers running around, but in downtown Frederick, they really have no convenient place to meet at scale. That lacks. That very much is a hole in the economic fabric. And of course, the politics around that downtown hotel have become insanely ugly, have involved state policymakers, local policymakers, all kinds of accusations, so on and so forth. I think we're missing the bigger picture here, which is, would that hotel work in downtown Frederick? Would it be financially viable? My conclusion is, yes, it would be. That's one. And second, would it generate spin-off economic benefits to the rest of the community? My view is, massive benefits. Because again, it really is a hole in the economic architecture of Frederick. It's really lacking. And so when when I do a fair amount of public speaking, when I go to downtown Frederick, there's no really great venue for me to speak. And among the venues that I speak around the country in, Frederick offers some of the worst. It's old, it's dingy, it's not nice, it's not upscale, it's not where you really want to bring your customers, your clients, your prospects, so on and so forth. And often when I speak in front of audiences, that's who the people who are putting the conference on are inviting, the kinds of people who are their stakeholders. So again, a real hole in the fabric of Frederick's economic architecture, and that could be a source of massive economic impact. And also a place where great ideas come together when you've got so many intellectuals running around doing what it is they do. So I'm all in on that. There has to be a financial package and these kinds of things. I understand that lots of private capital should be invested in this. You can't always rely on the public sector. But I think the community should make way for that new downtown hotel. I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle.
Is there a number for every dollar spent on a hotel stay? It generates $3, $4, $8, $1.50?
There are multiplier effect numbers, but it's project specific. How many people are coming from outside of the community? The magic of a hotel or any venue, let's say a Great Wolf Lodge in Cecil County, the magic of that from the perspective of economic impact is how many people from outside the community go there. Because that means that's new net revenues for the community and tax dollars, so on and so forth for the state, for instance, retail sales taxes, that kind of thing. So the question for a downtown Frederick venue, a hotel, will be how many people from outside of Frederick visit that hotel? How many people have their meetings there? As opposed to in Allegheny County, and even that's not a great comparison. What we really care about, as a state at least, is how many people come to that hotel in Frederick from outside of the state, bring money from Pennsylvania, or West Virginia, or elsewhere or Virginia, into our state. That's the way to grow an economy. So my feeling is that this should not simply be a local amenity. It should not be developed as simply a Frederick City or Frederick County amenity. This should be developed as a destination for the entire region, Mid-Atlantic, where you're inviting people from Virginia or West Virginia or Pennsylvania to a conference, and you have it in downtown Frederick because downtown Frederick is amazing. They can do a lot of things after the conference. And now you've got a first-tier venue with the latest audiovisual technology, so on and so forth, so that speakers want to be there, audience wants to be there. That's the magic. Have I modeled that? Given the latest incarnations, I have not modeled that. So I don't know what the multiplier is, but the multiplier will depend heavily upon how many people it can attract from outside of the community.
And for how long they stay.
Oh, that's for sure, right? So if this is a hotel that caters to both conferences, conventions, people who are trying to gather, but also for people who want to stay there for quite some time, let's say a weekend or the entire week because they want to shop, dine, whatever it happens to be in Frederick, or they want to visit, a phenomenal Civil War site in nearby Washington County, whatever it happens to be, then, or this is their staging ground for a trip to Washington, D.C., yes, that's right. How many people visit from outside the region, stay there, how long they stay, and of course, what their room rates are will determine that economic impact.
Would the explosion in Frederick and Loudoun to a certain extent have happened if it wasn't for all of the massive federal government spending that's taken place since the 90s, and particularly since 9/11?
Oh no, it would not be happening. All this investment that's taking place in fiber optics and communications, so on and so on. So it's been a combination of public sector investment and private sector investment to allow this to happen. I mean, you could think about our communications infrastructure as a country as being a public-private partnership. The same thing is true with our transportation infrastructure, public-private partnership, private rail, public roads, that kind of thing. And so, so no, the federal government's proximity, its spending on this kind of infrastructure clearly is one of the reasons we've seen what we've seen in Loudoun County and what we're going to see, potentially at least, in Frederick County.
Well, and also it impacted Frederick in terms of Fort Detrick and biotech spending, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. No, there's no question. I mean, I don't even know what they do at Fort Detrick in some sense, right? Pretty scary stuff, right? Weaponizing biology to a certain extent, or at least defending against the weaponization of biology. But yeah, of course, it's federal driven. And federal government driven. It's Fort Detrick, right? So government plays a major part in the endeavor. And a lot of things would not have happened in the Washington, Baltimore metropolitan area were it not for the federal government. I mean, we are blessed. We're home to NIH and FDA as a region. We're home to the NSA. Right? We're home to Aberdeen Proving Ground and Fort Detrick and Pax River Naval Air Station, Social Security Administration, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I mean, federal government is our primary industry. And that's one of the reasons I'm worried. And actually, this is another thing we should talk about, which is the federal government at this time has a $33 trillion national debt. Medicare insolvency faces in 2031, the Social Security Trust Fund insolvency in 2033. At some point, the federal government is not going to be able to spend the way it's been spending. Can't do it. Often it is the case that when we have crises like COVID, or any crisis, the federal government's deficits take off because the federal government is responding to the crisis. But then after the crisis, federal government spending comes back down. That didn't happen this time. Federal government spending keeps rising, and this is not a partisan issue, by the way. Democrats at this moment control the White House, Republicans the House of Representatives. So that's a bipartisan outcome. But the point is, at some point, the federal government is not going to be able to spend this way, and therefore, the Washington-Baltimore region is going to be in some trouble economically, because that's our number one industry. Think about what happens to to Detroit when the U.S. auto industry is stumbling. Well, that same kind of dynamic could be here in Washington, Baltimore. We're used to being among the most prosperous people in the world. We have fabulous government contracting jobs, fabulous government agency jobs, so on and so forth. What if that starts to dissipate? How would Frederick respond to that dissipation of transactional volume because the federal government is now dialing down its expenditures? To prepare for that, and we're talking about something probably in the 2030s, it has to diversify its economy now, which is another reason to support a downtown hotel, another reason to support data centers, to prepare for that kind of future. All these issues are tangled up with one another, and Frederick, as it turns out, is in the middle of it all. So that makes it a very interesting place.